Hi, my name is Nick Henshu. I'm a professor of ecology at the University of Buffalo in the Department of Environment and Sustainability. I'm also the Director of Undergraduate Studies. Today we're going to talk a little bit about one of my projects called Gray to Green, which is how we incorporate the post-industrial sites that we find all over Buffalo, brownfields and old factories, abandoned rail yards, things like that, into an existing greenway system, creating wilderness connectivity and green space connectivity for migrating pollinators, for recreation, for seed dispersal, and a whole host of other ecosystem services. Buffalo has a wonderful history of industrialization, of cutting edge technology, and of really being kind of the keystone of shipping and transportation, especially for grain, in the Great Lakes area. And when we look at things like, the Buffalo River, we see where this history is still very, very present. These are the great northern elevators down on off of Ganson Street, which are still there. This is a picture from 1903. Here was really Buffalo's claim to fame was grain elevators from any kind of wheat or oats or corn that was coming from any of the Midwest states. Was shipped across the Great Lakes and then brought into grain elevators here along the Buffalo River, where they were then either put onto smaller barges and floated up the Erie Canal, and then later loaded onto trains and taken either to Albany or back down through Altoona, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and onto Allentown in Philadelphia. So we've got this entire system of moving stuff through Buffalo. And what we see is a lot of the industries that built up around it became kind of dependent on these sort of industries. With that, of course, comes a lot of environmental damage. The quintessential story of this, of course, is just up the road in Niagara Falls, when we have the impact of Love Canal. And when those of you not familiar with the story, it kind of goes to the tune of, William Love tried to make a canal that went around the falls, of course runs out of money, and ends up with a big ditch. Hooker Chemical Company buys the land from him a few years later, fills it up with all their toxic waste and covers it over, sells the land to the Niagara Falls School District for $1 with the warning, hey, don't build on this, because bad things will happen. Of course, the school district does build on it, and we see all kinds of congenital birth defects, cancers, miscarriages, all that sort of thing popping up in the late 70s. So much so that Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time, comes up to Niagara Falls and declares this the very first Superfund site, where he establishes the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. And so a lot of those things happened right here in Western New York that precipitated this entire change in thought, this entire movement towards being more environmentally aware. What's interesting to me is so, I come from an area of eastern Pennsylvania where I'm about halfway. I grew up about halfway between New York City and Philadelphia, in a town called Easton. And when I first told my parents that we were moving up here to Buffalo, all our friends and family, and hey, I got this job as a professor at the University of Buffalo, and the feedback was kind of incredible, because everybody was, it's so snowy, it's Detroit light, you get shot, it's all rusty, it's all dirty, there's no jobs. And that may have been true in the 80s and part of the 90s, but the reality of it is that the city that we found when my wife and I moved here is not the city that we heard about. And the growth of Buffalo and the revitalization of Buffalo has just been an incredible experience. The food, the restaurants, the people, it really is the city of good neighbors. It's not just about snow and chicken wings. There's a lot of wonderful things happening here in Buffalo. And so what I want to do is kind of think about all of these positive facets of the revitalization of Buffalo, the cleaning of Buffalo. The water no longer lights on fire. The grain elevators aren't used the same way they once were, but we have this incredible opportunity to rebuild an entire city, to rebuild an entire region back to something that can be exceptionally green, back to something that could be thought of as really the nation, if not the world's leading laboratory of restoration ecology. And I'm super excited about that because it's right here. We're putting Buffalo back together, and we have the opportunity to do it and do it well. When we make that an example to other areas, it gives us a lot of leverage in how we spend our green space and how we think about parks and open areas. So what I'm thinking about doing is, and what I work a lot with is this concept of the Niagara River Greenway. The Niagara River Greenway is a corridor of connecting open spaces, of parks, and managed ecosystems from South Buffalo all the way up to Lake Ontario and to Lewiston. And this Niagara Greenway is an area that we specifically are looking at putting money into conservation, into parks, into recreation, into quality of life sort of things. And because we've got a lot of political will, and we've got a lot of public support, and we've got a lot of universities and great researchers across the board that are thinking about how we can have a wonderful impact on Buffalo, one small area at a time. My whole argument is we need to start thinking about post-industrial sites and brownfields and abandoned rail yards and old factories as potential sites for extension of the Niagara River Greenway. So here's sort of the plan, and this is something that we've been thinking about and talking about an awful lot the last few years. Is each of these bullet points that I'm going to share with you today fall roughly into the following 7 categories. Each of these right now is just ideas, and not all of them connect perfectly to every other thing. Obviously, for instance, school kids, at Kenmore East cannot go plant flowers in toxic, mercury-laden soils. Obviously, it's not all going to connect, but what we can think about, and you as learning environmentalists can think about ways to add to each of these research questions. And what I really like about all of this is that they all do connect somewhat to each other, and there's a lot of room for everyone's participation and everyone's involvement. So the first thing we need to start with are soils, and our soils here are indicated by a little white lump there on the side. And some of those questions that I've been thinking a lot about are things like soil types. We've never actually been able to characterize anthropic soils. It's just not done. They're just classified as urban soils and or anthropogenic soils. They're not characterized for silt, sand, clay. They're not characterized for concrete or asphalt or brick residue or old plaster. And I think we're missing the mark there, because each of those things, concrete for instance and old plaster, is going to be higher in lye content, which therefore is going to create more of an alkaline soil, as opposed to some other building materials that may increase the acidity. So we need to think about how we characterize soils, because without soils, we don't have anything else going on. We're not going to have plants. We're not going to have insects. We need to think about what the ability for success of soil microbes and soil macroinvertebrates are, and if those plants are even going to live in soils that we have in these post-industrial areas. A lot of this boils down to, and we're still learning about, mycorrhizal fungi and their symbiotic relationship with roots and plants, and what that all looks like long term. Can we get mycorrhizal hyphae to talk to other plants, and what can we do to enhance those linkages in that relationship? We also can think about these post-industrial soils for plants and how those functional groups might look. Functional groups and seed guilds might be two terms that you're sort of new to. Here, a functional group is like a leguminous plant, a nitrogen-fixing plant. They're not all parts of this. They're not all in the same genre. They might be trees versus pea plants, but they have the same function in an ecosystem, which is to sequester nitrogen and make it usable by plants. Whereas a seed guild might be more appropriate for, if we wanted to say, right, there's 13 different species of goldenrod. Which one of those species is most loved by pollinators and most likely to grow in soils that have a high zinc content, for instance? And so maybe we don't get the exact perfect native fit of the plant that belongs there, but we can come up with something that is very, very close, very sought after by pollinators and by insects, and will thrive in certain soil conditions. So we need to think a lot about native plants. And of course, if we're thinking about native plants, that's going to lead us to thinking about pollinators. There's about 420 different species of bee in New York State alone. 420 different species of bees. And most of them are solitary. Most of them are only above ground for a short period of time when their flower is in bloom. And we're not real sure what those all look like, or where they will thrive, and if there will be a bioaccumulation in these solitary bees. So what's to say we don't plant certain flowers that attract these solitary bees that are very rare, except that we're leading them to their death by allowing them to burrow into toxic soils. We also need to take a really strong look at pollinator biodiversity in urban and post-industrial soils, and work on this has just begun actually around New York City and around Baltimore, and what that looks like in terms of native local bees thriving in an urban ecosystem, because this is an entirely different set of rules. This is an entirely different ecosystem than Earth has ever had before. Is this post-industrial, an old rail yard has flowers growing on it. Well, somebody's got to be there to pollinate it. How are those bees going to work with those kinds of with those types of soils, with those types of plants? And can we create a sensible plan for allowing connectivity of migrating pollinators and migrating search areas? A bee can travel about 8 miles a day in any direction looking for plants to pollinate, and it's got certain host-specific plants that many of them prefer to pollinate. So can we preferentially look at areas in the Greenway plan that make the most sense in order to create a connective matrix of all of these kinds of post-industrial areas that have pollinator-friendly plants? Well, that obviously leads the question of, if we're looking at connectivity, now we're talking about geospatial inquiries. Things like connectivity for migrating pollinators, and how do we connect, areas on one side or another of railroad tracks or of the highway, or in our case along the Niagara River. How do we create connected patches from the islands that are in the Niagara River to the onshore patches that have similar plants? So these become geospatial questions, and looking at where we're going to prioritize the effect of creating these green spaces is going to lead us to creating logical greenway connectivity for seed dispersal as well. That seed dispersal is going to depend on wind, on water, working with the flow of water and with common weather patterns. And we're going to think about prioritizing our restoration efforts based on the nearest neighbor optimization theory, which is to say that we're looking at doing things in clusters that make the most sense to get the most effect from our efforts. So how do we prioritize certain areas for restoration? Do we specifically look at the old First Ward? Do we specifically look at Tonawanda or North Tonawanda as areas that make the most sense to optimize our restoration efforts? And that strikes me as that we need to target areas where post-industrial remediation will lead to greater health outcomes. Greater health outcomes from the people who live there. Greater health outcomes and economic outcomes from the people who are near and around and interacting with these spaces. And these, of course, are equity questions. We need to target areas where post-industrial remediation will lead to greater health outcomes, because if we start to include small post-industrial areas cumulatively and then add the big areas, the vacant lots, the traffic triangles, the median strips, the setbacks, the rights-of-way, the rail beds, all of these kind of areas start to add up very quickly. It's great to want to restore Bethlehem Steel. It's great to want to restore Tonawanda Coke. These are hundreds, if not thousands, of acres in size. But do we get a more equitable, do we get a more prioritized, do we get more bang for our buck if we specifically target small vacant lots in low-income neighborhoods for restoration? That entire line of thinking also, especially in the old First Ward, especially along the Times Beach downtown corridor, gets us to thinking about doing restoration that specifically helps with climate resiliency and slowing of flooding, better management of rainwater. All of these are major issues downtown, and it would make a lot of sense to create and work with a changing climate in order to have the greatest amount of resiliency for people in those neighborhoods. All of those questions start to lead to economic questions. So what are our secondary effects of green space? What happens as we improve local economies? If we improve health, if we improve quality of life, the economy goes up as well. Now we can start talking about creating native plant nurseries that are driven by market demands, because everybody's putting in native plants instead of just the same arborvitaes they bought at Home Depot. We have space to train in green infrastructure, things like rainwater retention basins, rain gardens, all of permeable concrete, all of these kinds of things, especially in poorer neighborhoods that have been really trampled by post-industrial effects. One of the things I like to point out about this is it's not really a research question, but on the plus side, this novel way of looking at restoration, this novel way of thinking about our priorities for restoration ecology, because it's new and because it so seamlessly fills out all of these different boxes, really will act as a great funding source for many different groups like Niagara Waterkeeper, or Buffalo Audubon, or the Western New York Land Conservancy. All of these kinds of groups will benefit as we work together at creating this new downtown Buffalo. And the new downtown Buffalo is heavily involved in community, and that has a tremendous amount of potential to get involvement with local small restoration projects, to increase the clean greenway connectivity as extensions to local parks and local trails. And we can think about things like school group involvement. Mrs. Smith's 5th grade class makes bee houses every year for the vacant lot across from the school. As we build that awareness, we end up with a citizenry that is more educated and makes better overall civic decisions about the health and care of the environment. All of these places we can get involved. All these jumping off points are places where people can help in the revitalization of downtown Buffalo. They're all connected. And so the first thing we need to do is, and we are pretty much on task right now for the 2020 year, is to think about soil collection and qualification, right? And the plant project is doing seed collection and native plots at the University of Buffalo. We're going to work on trapping and IDing pollinators in post-industrial ecosystems, and we need to classify the guilds of bees and bee flies that are there. We need to start working on habitat connectivity for prioritization. Where does it make the most sense to start? And the last thing we're focusing on in this 2-year cycle is to offer more and continuing restoration and green infrastructure courses through partners. Places like Silo City, Waterkeeper, Western New York Land Conservancy, they're all working towards creating, Push Buffalo is another one, is creating green infrastructure courses that are training people how to do rainwater retention, and how to do climate resiliency, and how to do native garden plantings. In the next cycle, we'd like to start classifying and quantifying the toxicants that are in the post-industrial ecosystems, things like mercury, lead, zinc, cadmium. We need to think about defining the native functional groups and guilds of plants and pollinators. And we need to start looking at key areas and neighborhoods as focus areas for the other 6 topics. The baseline health survey, baseline economics survey, that'll be all in the next cycle. And as we build into the next 10 to 15 years, we can start to look at health improvements as a result of our long-term research. So this is a 15-year plan that eventually will impact everybody that lives in Western New York. We're going to use school groups for native plants and native bees, best current practices guidebooks that teachers and scout leaders and youth groups can all use as part of their curriculum. So we have a tremendous amount of very, very exciting, very novel research, and there's a ton of places to get involved. And so when you are listening to this lecture, I want you to think about questions that you can ask, and things that we don't really know about yet, and places that you can get involved with the restoration of turning our gray areas into green.